You are standing on a strip of jungle 50 miles wide, and it is going to make you rich, or it is going to kill you. That was the wager a French company made in the 1880s, fresh off the glory of cutting a canal through the Egyptian desert at Suez, betting the Isthmus of Panama would bend the same way. It didn't. Suez was flat sand and salt water. Panama was a mountain range wrapped in rainforest, and the rainforest fought back in a way no engineer had aimed for yet. The plan was simple on paper: cut straight through at sea level, no locks, no dams, just a trench from ocean to ocean. The reality was a river that flooded without warning, rock that turned to liquid mud in the wet season, and a death toll that climbed past 20,000 before the company folded. Workers came from Caribbean islands, from France, from anywhere labor could be bought, and thousands of them never left. Yellow fever alone could empty a barracks in a week. Nobody knew why. The doctors blamed the swamp air, the filth, the tropical climate itself, anything but the truth buzzing past their ears every night. By the time the money ran out and the company collapsed in scandal, the Isthmus had swallowed a fortune, and something far worse than a fortune. The jungle didn't just beat the shovels, it beat the era's most celebrated canal builders, and it left equipment rusting in an unfinished cut, waiting for someone braver, or maybe just better informed, to try again.
Say you're a doctor in Havana in the 1880s, watching yellow fever tear through a city block, while the house next door, just as filthy, stays untouched. That contradiction haunted colonial medicine for decades. The prevailing wisdom said dirt caused disease, rotting waste, bad air, poor drainage. So cities scrubbed their streets, and the fever kept coming anyway. One physician in Havana had a different idea. What if it wasn't the filth at all, but a mosquito, picking the disease up from one sick person and carrying it to the next? For years, almost a team of army doctors went to Cuba to test it directly, using volunteers and mosquitoes raised from his own eggs, and the results were impossible to argue with. Volunteers who slept in rooms full of soiled bedding from yellow fever patients stayed perfectly healthy. Volunteers bitten by a single mosquito that had fed on a sick patient came down with the fever days later. The insect was the vector, not the smell, not the dirt. A tiny, private mosquito, no bigger than a fingernail. It was one of those moments where an entire field of medicine had to admit it had been solving the wrong problem for 100 years. And it meant that beating tropical disease wasn't going to be about scrubbing floors. It was going to be about killing standing water, screening windows, and treating a jungle isthmus like a battlefield against something you could barely see. That discovery is the reason the second attempt at this canal would look nothing like the first.
Picture the man they sent to finish what France couldn't. An army doctor who'd already proven the mosquito theory worked, standing in front of officials who thought he was chasing insects while people kept dying. He'd cleaned up yellow fever in Havana almost completely within a couple of years, using exactly the methods everyone had mocked: draining pools, oiling gutters, screening every window in the city. When he arrived in Panama in 1904, he tried to do the same thing on a much bigger, much wetter piece of land. And at first, it looked like it was failing. Deaths kept happening. Within a year, most of the original American workforce panicked and went home. His own commission wanted him fired, convinced he was ignoring the real problem of general sanitation. He had exactly one thing working in his favor. The president believed him. With that backing, he scaled up instead of backing down. Men fumigating houses, cutting brush, pouring oil across anything that could hold standing water for more than a few days. And then the numbers turned. The last case of yellow fever on the Isthmus was recorded in December of 1906. And after that, the disease that had haunted this isthmus for a generation simply stopped killing anyone here. Malaria was a harder fight. It hid in blood, not just water, and mosquitoes could still find plenty of it in workers already infected. But the malaria death rate among canal employees fell by roughly 10 times over the next 3 years. It's easy to talk about the canal in terms of steel and concrete, but none of the digging that followed would have been possible without this fight, fought first, against something almost too small to see. Here's the argument that almost derailed the American Canal before a single major cut was dug. Should it run straight through its sea level, the way the French had tried? Or should it lift ships up and over the mountains using locks and an artificial lake? A board of engineers actually studied both, and a majority of them recommended sea level. Cheaper on paper, no massive dam to build, nothing but a long trench connecting two oceans. But the chief engineer at the time had spent enough time standing next to the Chagres River in flood season to know that river would destroy a sea level canal every rainy season, permanently. He argued loudly and repeatedly that the only sane approach was to tame that river instead of fighting it forever. Dam it, turn it into a lake, and let ships climb over the high ground using locks instead of digging through it. The question went all the way to Congress, and after fierce debate in both chambers, the lock plan went out. That decision reshaped the entire project. Instead of a flat ditch, the plan became a dam at Gatun, holding back the Chagres River, creating an artificial lake sitting roughly 85 feet above the ocean. At the time, the largest reservoir and largest dam ever built by human hands. Ships wouldn't cut through the mountain at all. They'd sail up onto a plateau, cross a lake stitched together from a tamed river, and get lowered back down the other side. It was a completely different kind of canal than anyone had built before, and it only existed because one engineer refused to let the cheaper option win.
Even with the lock plan settled, one obstacle refused to cooperate: a nearly 9-mile stretch through the spine of the continent, where the land itself didn't want to stay cut. Engineers called it the cut, and the plan was straightforward enough: blast the rock, load it onto rail cars, haul it away, lower the ridge down to something ships could pass through. What they hadn't fully accounted for was what happens when you slice into a saturated hillside in one of the wettest places on the planet. In the fall of 1907, a crack opened along one slope, and over the following days, roughly 500,000 cubic yards of soaked clay began sliding into the cut like a glacier made of mud, moving an average of about 14 feet a day for 10 days straight. It wasn't the only one. Over the years the cut was open, it suffered more than 100 separate slides, some burying equipment, some threatening to bury men, some pushing so much material back into the trench that months of digging vanished overnight. Part of a nearby town had to be dismantled and moved before it slid into the excavation along with everything else. Engineers eventually figured out the slides came in two different flavors: wet material sliding over slick rock, and dry rock simply collapsing because the slopes above it had been cut too steep. Either way, the fix was the same: widen the cut, flatten the walls, and accept that this mountain was going to keep fighting until the very end. When two steam shovels finally met face to face at the bottom of the cut in the spring of 1913, it wasn't a clean finish, it was a surrender, negotiated one landslide at a time. Here is the part that sounds like magic until you see the plumbing. Not a single pump moves the ships up this canal. Gravity does all of it. Each set of lock chambers is enormous, about 1,000 feet of usable length, over 100 feet wide, 40 feet deep, and they work in pairs and triples, stepping vessels up from sea level to the lake and back down again on the far side. The trick is in the walls. Buried inside them are giant culverts, wide enough to walk through, running the length of each chamber, with smaller side tunnels branching off beneath the floor. Open a valve, and water from the higher chamber simply flows downhill through those tunnels into the lower one, because water always finds its own level. Once the two chambers match, the massive steel gates swing open because the pressure on both sides is finally equal. Those gates are built in a shallow V shape, pointed toward the higher water, a shape that means the weight of the lake itself presses the two leaves together and seals them tighter the harder the water pushes. It's a system with almost no moving parts fighting nature, because it's built to use nature's own math. Filling a chamber the size of a football field takes only about 10 minutes. A ship enters near sea level, rises 3 separate times up to Gatun Lake, crosses that artificial lake for miles over what used to be jungle and riverbed, then descends through another set of locks on the far coast.
No engine on the ship does that lifting. The lake, sitting 85 feet above the sea, does it for free, one gravity-fed chamber at a time.
On August 15, 1914, the canal formally opened, and a ship could cross from one ocean to the other in about a day's work instead of weeks around the tip of South America. It's worth sitting with what it took to get there. The French effort a generation earlier had lost tens of thousands of lives to diseases nobody understood, and folded under the weight of that ignorance as much as the dead. The American effort that followed didn't succeed because it was smarter about concrete. It succeeded because it solved the invisible problem first, hunting down standing water and mosquito breeding grounds with the same intensity later poured into excavation. It succeeded because one engineer won an argument in Washington about lakes and locks instead of a straight cut, trading a cheaper plan for one that could survive a flooding river. And it succeeded because thousands of laborers kept coming back to a mountain that tried to bury them in mud more than 100 separate times, clearing away each slide and cutting the slopes back until the ground finally held still. None of that shows up when you look at a photograph of a finished lock gate closing behind a ship. What you're actually looking at is a math problem about gravity, a public health campaign fought with oil cans and window screens, and a decade of stubbornness against a piece of geography that never once made this easy. The canal didn't get built because the engineering was obvious. It got built because everyone who mattered refused to accept the mountain's first answer. If you want more of these stories, the builds that shouldn't have worked, the decisions that changed everything, subscribe to MegaBuilt and come along.